Hello, welcome to another edition of the Pace Report. I'm Brian Pace reporting live here at Lincoln Center for this year's kickoff of the Lincoln Center Out of Doors series here at Lincoln Center here in New York City. When you think of Nile Rodgers, you think of one of the most prolific guitarists, arrangers, producers, songwriters over the last 40 years. In fact, Nile's cadre of artists is so vast. He's recorded and produced with the likes of Diana Ross, Madonna, David Bowie, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Jimmy Page, and the Honey Drippers. The list goes on and on. Tonight we're going to sit down and talk about the origins of Nile Rodgers here in New York City. We're going to talk about the legacy of Chic, one of the most important and prolific soul dance bands of the late 1970s or early 80s. And we're also going to sit down and reflect on his musical brothers, the late Tony Thompson as well as Bernard Edwards, who made up Chic. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the sounds of Mr. Nile Rodgers and the Chic organization live here at the Lincoln Center Out of Doors series here at Lincoln Center here in New York City. Now, congratulations on your autobiography. This is a long time coming. I mean, you have an incredible story.
Agreed.
Tell me about the process of writing this book, because I mean, this is pretty much also a healing point too, because you've been through a lot. You've been through cancer. You've been through the loss of your musical brothers, your mother, I mean, this is a lot.
Yeah. Basically, what happened was it took 4 years to get through the process. I would say at least 60% of the time was basically just doing the research, and 40% of the time was putting it in a sort of cinematic way. It was basically learning how to write a longer story. Up until I wrote the book, the longest thing I'd ever written in my life was maybe 3-5 pages, a love letter or a breakup letter with a girlfriend, and that was it. So I actually had to learn the process from the ground up. And the wonderful thing about my writing coach was that he challenged me, and he didn't realize that he was challenging me. He told me that writing a book was basically like writing a song without a chorus, was just writing one great verse after the next. And I just thought to myself, I'm a songwriter and I write popular songs that have choruses. There's no way I'm just going to not have some sort of chorus type of format to the book. And I worked in a chorus type of format, which I focused on Thanksgiving Day, which is a revolving theme that just happened to be one of the biggest events that ever happened. When I was 8 years old, my stepfather had his first heroin overdose, and it seems like every Thanksgiving since there's some big event that's happened.
You know, your career goes some 40 years musically, and you've written and you've played with a lot of people, but the beginning started in New York City.
Yeah, and it's still here in New York City. I mean, I started out at Sesame Street. Believe it or not, when I was deciding that I was going to go further my musical education, I was trying to figure out whether I was going to join Juilliard Extension Division, which had just started up that year, or Manhattan School of Music, which had already had an extension division. Both were teaching classical guitar, and I looked at the bulletin board, and they were auditioning for Sesame Street. And I auditioned and I got the job. So instead of going to school, I went to work.
So your university still is the University of Nile Rodgers Music?
Basically, I mean, I had incredible private tutors, and I've had the benefit of the New York City public school system, which when I was a kid had a very broad curriculum, and music was an important part of that curriculum. It's just a part of the curriculum that I favored and stuck with.
Where did you start off musically as far as instrument, and when did you really kind of find your calling as far as the guitar and also just the other instruments that you play, because you're very diverse?
Yeah, well, in school, they started us with this thing called the tonet or the recorder, these very sort of simple wood and either wood or plastic flute type of devices that were basically like ocarina type of instruments. And then I moved very quickly to the actual proper flute, because we were doing symphonic music by the time I was 8 years old. And I stuck with woodwinds. And then I moved to the clarinet, and I stayed on the clarinet until I was 15 years old. So that's really where I got most of my training, which was playing the clarinet. The unbelievable great fortune in my life was, because we were very poor, I was able to amass all that clarinet music over the years. And when I decided to switch to the guitar, because this girl that I fancied needed a guitar player in her band, I noticed right away that the clarinet and the guitar had the same written range. So I had all this ton of music that I had saved over all these years that I could study the guitar on, even though the technique was completely different. Because I knew the music and I could read well, it gave me an advantage over most guitar players who are, by and large, notoriously bad music readers.
You know, coming up in the 60s and early 70s, you pretty much in New York had a hybrid of all kinds of music styles. You had the Latin jazz thing going, you had soul music going, you had rock and roll going. And that kind of pretty much was the nucleus of how and where you are right now, as far as how you have worked with the musicians that you've produced and written for over the years.
The great thing about my upbringing is that because the New York music scene is so incredibly diverse, and also because I wanted to work, I worked with all sorts of people. I worked with Latin bands. I worked with African bands. I worked with bar mitzvah bands. Believe it or not, my very first recording session was doing traditional Hebrew song, Lacha Dodi. Was the very first time I recorded and got paid. So I worked with a lot of bar mitzvah bands, a lot of wedding bands. I worked for the Gypsies. I did a lot of gypsy weddings. So we had to learn Hungarian music. We had to learn everything. And thank God, because of my classical training, I was very aware of the modal approaches to those styles of music, and was never really lost, and was comfortable right away when I started gigging. It was only when I started to play, when I started to really compose on my own, that I found my footing. And that was, when the whole R&B dance music explosion in the mid to late 70s just sort of took over New York City. And it felt like, even though that sound for America really started, from my point of view, in Philadelphia, not counting the hardcore funk scene, I'm talking about the real dance, four on the floor stuff, the Philly sound, New York seemed to really perfect it and make it a little bit more international. The dance bands and the jazz artists that were based in New York started to do more European modal type of music with these tight grooves, these funk grooves, and that felt right to me. That felt urban, that felt New York. It felt like our style of funk was sophisticated and very different than the hardcore, either Midwest or West Coast funk. Like a band like Chic or GQ, we didn't sound like we came from Ohio or the West Coast. We sounded like we came from New York or New Jersey. We were definitely urban and sort of shiny and polished, and had a different approach to our funk. We used to call it sophisto funk, because it's funky, but it's not that hard, as George Clinton would say, it's not that hard on the one kind of funk.
70s, you hooked up with one of your musical brothers by the name of Bernard Edwards. Tell me about how this amalgamation and friendship started.
Bernard worked at the post office at the main branch there on 34th Street. And he worked next to my girlfriend's mother. And she had never heard him play before, but just because of his demeanor and just the way he carried himself, she had a feeling that there was something very special about his musicality. So she hooked us up, but when we first spoke, we didn't see eye to eye. As a matter of fact, he told me to lose his number, and he didn't really want to talk to me again. And it just happened, fate put us together, because in those days we used to do pickup bands where a guy would call you up and say, hey, the gig is paying whatever, meet us at this location at this time, and you'd show up and you play the gig. And most of the time you wouldn't know anybody except for one person. And on this particular gig, I knew no one. And I was replacing the guitar player that normally did the gig with this band leader. And the bass player happened to be Bernard Edwards. At that time, I didn't know that he was the guy who told me to lose his number, and he didn't know that I was the weird hippie guy who wanted to form this band with a cross between Fairport Convention, man, you know, like in the Grateful Dead, with a little mixture of Ornette Coleman, man, you know, like that. I was gone. I was way out there. So what happened was, on this particular gig, both Bernard and I were very responsible, and we knew that the unit had to sound like a cohesive, tight unit, or else we wouldn't have that gig next week. We were playing at a joint in the Bronx called the Fair Tree Lounge, and the Fair Tree was accustomed to having good bands, you know, Joe Tex and people like that. So Bernard and I pulled this together, and we just started calling out the changes to the whatever the popular songs were that the audience was recommended, be it complicated like, you know, Jackson 5 arrangements, I Want You Back and things like that, or something as simple and groovy as Sissy Strut. And that's what happened. And we both had this thing, because wherever he didn't have it covered, I'd have it covered, and we had it. We just pulled that band together so that the front guy could come off like a star, like a performer. And from that moment on, we decided whatever gig he got, meaning Bernard, he would call me as a guitar player, and whatever gig I got, I call him as a bass player. It only took us about 6 months before we were riding on the subway that my girlfriend's mom happened to get on the subway car that he and I happened to be on. And she walked towards me, and of course I thought she was coming to say hello to me because we lived together. She walked right past me and went to Bernard and went, hey, you cats finally hooked up. And he looked at me and went, that was you? And from that moment on, we cracked up and we laughed. And he said, yeah, I guess she was right. You did have something special. And I said, yeah, I guess she was right. You did have something special. And we were basically inseparable from that moment on. Even whenever we would have our little spats, Bernard was always my boy, always in my corner. I could call him for anything ever, no matter what.
Come on, put your hands together, everybody. Sing with us.
your group Chic included a drummer by the name of Tony Thompson, and Norma Jean was also the vocalist also. Tell me about how you guys got together. And I understand that Chic was an inspiration from Roxy music.
Yeah, basically what happened is Bernard and I were in a group called the Big Apple Band. We were the backing band for a Philadelphia soul group called New York City, strangely enough. Philly soul group called New York City. And they had one hit called "I'm Doing Fine Now." Down, 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 down. So exactly, without you, baby. So that was our record. We gigged on that record for like 2 years or more. And when they released their second album, which netted no hits, the band broke up. It just happened that when they broke up, we were in London, and it also just happened that my wallet had been stolen. So the band went home and left me in London because I had to get a new passport on Monday when the passport when the American embassy opened. So they left on Friday, and I hung out with my girlfriend over the weekend. And her band at the time that she liked was this group called Roxy Music, which I had never heard of. So I went to see Roxy Music with her, and I had never experienced anything like this. They were sophisticated, they were sort of glamorous, the audience was glamorous, and they were actually playing at a place called the Roxy Theater or the Roxy something or other, the Roxy. So it was Roxy Music at the Roxy with this glamorous crowd that just sort of overwhelmed me. And I remember thinking that this was a completely immersive artistic experience in music, almost as if you had gone into a museum and it was the King Tut exhibit and they closed the doors and you feel like you're in ancient Egypt. When I was in that theater in the Roxy with Roxy, I felt like everything about that environment was Roxy. And I thought to myself, boy, what if a black group could do something like that? What if we could change the environment so that it feels like it's our home, like a circus or a museum? And then I talked to Bernard about this concept, and we started putting this band together. The first person we hired was Tony Thompson, and he was a drummer who had just left the band LaBelle, so he understood the idea of concept and fantasy fusion and funk and all that stuff. And then the next person we hired was a guy named Rob Sabino, a keyboard player. And Rob Sabino was friends with a guy named Ace Frehley, who was in a band called Kiss that didn't have a record deal yet, but they had a following. We went to check out Kiss one night with Rob, and that sealed the deal. All of a sudden I said, we're on to something. Because when you went to see Kiss, just like Roxy Music, it was a totally immersive artistic experience. And when they left the stage, you had no idea who they were. I could sit right next to Ace and we could talk and chat, and nobody would even talk to him. They would just walk right past him because they had no idea he was the guy in Kiss. And I'll never forget when the big deal it was when Kiss finally took off their makeup, because for years no one had any idea what Kiss looked like when they were off stage. Even though Gene Simmons is taller than most, there are a lot of tall guys in New York City. So that just solidified the concept. Like, we decided we were going to put these designer suits on, and we weren't going to dress up like other types of R&B bands, which had the typical outfits and the uniforms where everything was the same. We were going to go to high fashion couture designers and have serious outfits, like mega. And at the time, the girl that I was dating had just graduated from FIT. So she knew everybody. She would introduce us to people like Jane Barnes, who was just starting out, Norma Kamali, who was just starting out. When you look at the early Chic tour, all of our girls are dressed in Norma Kamali, because we basically we hit the scene at the same time. And that was the other thing that was interesting about Chic, is that we were able to talk about these designers in our music and live in that cutting edge fashion world, even though we didn't really know much about it. We were just sort of making it up as we went along.
What does soul music mean to you?
Soul music is unbelievably broad. I mean, gospel is soul to me, funk is soul, R&B is soul, disco is soul to me. That doesn't mean that every form of disco is soulful. When I used to watch a television show like Soul Train, I thought that encompassed soul, because you could see people like James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, Chic, Parliament Funkadelic. It's a broad spectrum, just like rock and roll. Just like jazz. It's a very, very broad description, and I believe that everything I play is soul music, whether I'm playing rock and roll or classical or jazz, because I interpret it in a soulful way.
That'll do it again for another edition of the Pace Report, reporting live here at the Lincoln Center Out of Doors series here at Lincoln Center here in New York City. I'd like to personally thank Mr. Nile Rodgers for his time, as well as the staff and management here at Lincoln Center. As always, please visit my website, www.thepacereport.com, for my weekly column as well as my past segments. Until next time, remember, if it's in the groove, it'll make you move. Until next time, peace.